Well, my name is Vivek Mehta. I'm a radiation oncologist in practice in Seattle at the Swedish Cancer Institute. I'm not sure how many of you have been out here to visit or know this area very well, but the Swedish Cancer Institute is the oldest cancer institute west of the Mississippi. It's now 76 years old. The practice in terms of radiation oncology is actually quite large. There are 14 of us that are in this practice, so it's a relatively vibrant group of people. It's been a long track record. In fact, the Seattle Prostate Institute is part of this practice. There's a gamma knife, a cyber knife, tomotherapy, image-guided radiotherapy, and a large brachytherapy program. And I joined this group after training about 10 years ago. And when I came to this group about 10 years ago, one of the tasks was to build a radiation oncology research program. So I want to be able to tell you a little bit about what that means in terms of developing a research program, should you try to do that in community practice. Just something to think about before we get going too far, and that is that if you're thinking about cancer care in the U.S. today, 80 or 85% of the patients that are treated today are treated in community practice. So somewhere in the neighborhood of only 15 or at most 20% are actually treated in the academic setting. So most of you, or many of you, are going to end up in community practice, and most of the patients are treated in the community. So I think the topic of sort of how to do research in the community practices is certainly something that that warrants a little bit of discussion. I'm happy to answer questions at any point in time. If people want to use the chat function, that might be the easiest way to do it. If that's difficult, we could probably unmute the mics or something like that. But I want to go through a few points. But like I said, I'm happy to interrupt and answer questions as we go through this. One of the first questions that comes to mind is why would you do any research at all? And I think if you're thinking about joining a private group or a group that's part of a community hospital, one of the things that you'll find is that research is highly valued. There have been a number of market analyses that have been done across the country about how patients choose where to get their care. And one of the things that comes at the top of that list is patients choosing centers that seem to be leading edge centers. And when pushed, leading edge is sort of synonymous with doing research or developing new ways to treat cancer. And so it's clearly recognized at the administrative level that having some sort of research program is vibrant to the overall practice, vibrant to the overall hospital, and vibrant to at the end of the day, patients coming in the door, which is sort of what the business of all of this is. The second thing I would tell you is that it's difficult in the real world to lay claim to any sort of individual expertise. So the way that we normally do that is we say that we went to medical school, then we say we went to residency, then we say we got board certified, and that's the individual expertise. But if you're also involved in research, it seems to elevate your status, actually, at least from a patient perspective and an administrative perspective. So it's another argument for why you might want to be involved in research. And the final component of all of this is that centers are being judged now in a variety of new ways, and many of these new metrics have yet to be fully defined. But one of them is this desire to be a center for excellence, meaning that you deliver excellent cancer care. And if you deliver excellent cancer care, one of the components of that is to be involved in research programs that can improve the outcomes for patients that are being treated. So the answer to why you might want to do this, which I think most of you who've already tuned in are already interested in doing it, is probably in somewhere in those three components. One of the very simple ways of getting involved in research at a community hospital is, if that community hospital, that community practice isn't already, becoming a satellite member for one of the large cooperative groups. Now, everybody talks about how these all cooperative groups are eventually going to all merge, but until that happens, becoming an ECOG affiliate site, an RTOG affiliate site, or a SWOG site, if you were large enough and you could meet the accrual goals of, more than one patient a month, you might become your own site. But if it's going to be something like one patient every 3 or 4 months, it's much easier to become an affiliate of one of the other sites that's out there. So for example, here in Seattle, Swedish, where I practice, is a member of SWOG and one of the early members of SWOG, and we must have somewhere in the neighborhood of 14 to 30 different community hospitals that are affiliates of us and that participate in research sort of under our SWOG umbrella, if you will. But what that allows each of those sites to do is locally offer patients participation on any of those SWOG protocols that come up and enroll. What it allows you as a physician at each of those sites to be is to be the PI at that location. So we're answering important questions, we're getting patients on studies, and some of the work effort has already been done because these large cooperative groups have helped define what those trials are going to be, and you're going to be a participant in terms of enrolling those patients on trial. I'm not sure how many of you have actually looked into this, but if you look at most of the cooperative groups, the vast majority of the patients come from these affiliated sites. So if you were at one of these community practices, you would be enrolling at your site, encouraging your partners to enroll at their sites. You might be committed to attend annual or semi-annual meetings for the organization, whether it was SWOG or whether it was RTOG. And this is something that maybe isn't as clear to you, that you actually, when you attend these meetings, have an opportunity to develop the next generation of those protocols, particularly if you're a radiation oncologist. When you attend the SWOG meeting, for example, there's very few radiation oncologists in attendance. They're often thirsting for radiation oncology participation within the different committees. So you have an opportunity to go into those different committees, be the radiation oncology PI on any number of trials if you decide that you want to do that. And if that trial is successful, or even if it's not successful, it leads to publications, and your ability to participate in that increases. So cooperative groups are clearly a good way of sort of going about getting research up and running at your sites. If you were thinking about sort of the downsides to this, there's a fair bit of administrative work that goes involved in this, and as the lead PI at any one site, you're typically tasked with a lot of those administrative responsibilities. Now, another way of sort of building a research program, or in conjunction with building the program via the RTOG or SWOG or ECOG, is to actually come up with your own idea, or your own idea in concert with somebody who has an interest in that idea, and develop a single institution trial. And this is across the spectrum, but there are a number of pharmaceutical companies that will always be looking for sites to participate on the next trial, and many of the trials of their agents are in combination with radiation, or they're an add-on to a standard platform. So chemo and radiation used for disease X, followed by their add-on drug. In any case, working with pharmaceutical industry to either develop that trial initially, or take one of the trials that they have in mind and become a site for them, is another way of getting some research off the ground. The medical device industry is also very interested in partnering with sites to do research, and you know, I think that interestingly there's a bias in both pharma and medical device to reach out to younger people that are fresh out of training to help drive some of these new trials, and they're very willing to fund those, partly because they're looking for energy, and usually people fresh out of training have energy. And then the last thing I would tell you is that if you really do want to sort of build an institutional research program, philanthropy is the best way to go about that. So hospital foundations often have money set aside for helping to develop or jumpstart these sorts of programs, and hospital foundations often have people that they can go to with ideas, who have deeper pockets, who can say, yeah, that's something I'd be very interested in funding. There are a number of things that have been funded in the past that sort of came out of philanthropy money to get things going. Another component of sort of building a research program or thinking about that internally is sort of developing a retrospective research program, or a retrospective / quasi-prospective research program. So you land in this community practice and you start to think, well, what are some of the things that we're doing? How can I measure the outcomes of what we're doing? How can I adjust to see whether something makes a difference, it's meaningful or not meaningful? And you build your own sort of, like I said, retrospective/prospective database on a particular type of patient or a particular type of treatment that you sort of follow. Many people would naturally think that, well, then how am I going to potentially compete with larger centers, or how would I compete with some sort of academic center? It turns out that you're really not competing with any of those people. If you crystallize what it is that you're looking for, crystallize your data collection, there's a place for that information, and there's multiple opportunities and forums to present that. The second bullet point on this slide, I think, is perhaps a more important reason for doing some of this, and that is that our field and cancer in general and healthcare overall is rapidly changing, and the way reimbursement is going to occur in the future is rapidly changing. A lot of people are talking about bundled payments, pay for performance, and a variety of other metrics that will determine how you get paid and the quality of care that you deliver. And it may be that it's starting to put together these databases in your own institution about the outcomes and how your patients do is going to be mission critical in the future for whether or not we get paid for that. And so building some of that at the get-go might be worthwhile. When we do our residency training or we stay in the academic centers, we're sometimes not quite as in tune with this particular aspect, but when you get out into community cancer care programs, you become more in tune more quickly because the operations are leaner and changes in reimbursement have a much bigger effect in terms of their ability to provide care. So I made a list here of what I put here as examples, but I think that it's important to remember that, you know, the very first center that had 3D conformal radiotherapy capabilities in the state of California was in a small city called Chico. Zoft, which is a form of electronic brachytherapy, treated its first patient in a small community practice in Georgia. Mammocyte started in a small community practice. Prostate Brachytherapy, which we're very familiar with here in Seattle, you know, sort of got its legendary sense from a small community hospital in North Seattle, not even in the Seattle proper. SBRT for lung cancer wasn't pioneered at one of the major academic places that you normally think about. Gamma Knife got started by many small private companies, putting them into small surrounding large metropolitan areas, you know, to start the treatment. IGRT started off in the community before it got to many of the academic sites. So depending on where you are in community practice, you might be an early adopter of technologies that aren't actually readily available in other places. I vividly remember visiting a community practice that had one of the very first 4D treatment modules for patients with lung cancer, thinking, wow, this would be really amazing. Wouldn't it have been great if we had had something like this at Stanford? So I think that you can't underestimate the value that the technology and where it perpetuates can go to places outside the academic center first. I started to make a slide talking about the different things that we do in radiation oncology that we consider standards, where the very first publications on those standards came from community practices. The slide just became too lengthy, and I didn't think there was any way to prioritize that. But I again, just sort of reiterate that things don't have to start in the academic center. But if you are going to embark on a program like this, there are some things to sort of keep in mind. Usually, you're going to have less administrative support. My colleagues in academic centers will say that some of their administrative support is actually a headache, but the truth of the matter is that most academic centers are set up to do research They encourage research, and the support is there. In community practices, they have to find people to help you to do this sort of stuff. The other thing that I can tell you is that you're usually going to have less interest from your colleagues. Sometimes the best you could hope for is colleagues that wish you along and tell you this is a great idea, great idea, great idea. But if you're hoping for them to sit down and cull charts, or hoping for them to do other work for you, that might be too much of a wish. And the same is true for getting interest from other disciplines. When you're in the academic center and you have an idea, it's usually easy to engage radiology or pathology because their name will end up in the middle of that paper and they're thrilled that they get something for nearly nothing. In the community practice setting, some of these people in these other disciplines are not as interested in helping if it means additional work for them. So it's something that you have to navigate. These are things that that are not necessarily things that can't be overcome. You simply find the people that you want to work with, and your program sort of builds in that direction. The last thing is that in community practice, you're still really judged on your patient care and taking good care of patients, and so if the reason for doing this research is some sort of acknowledgement or accolades, that doesn't usually happen until you actually have some sort of tangible result. So while you're doing it, it's sort of more of a labor of love, and you're sort of toiling in anonymity in a sense. Whereas in the academic setting, people are applauding you along as you continue to accrue. So I kind of wanted to open it up to questions, but tell you a little bit about what I've done in the last 10 years here. We brought RTOG to the Swedish Cancer Institute, and I'm the local PI for all the RTOG trials. We primarily only accrue on the brain studies in RTOG. I've been part of SWOG for the last 10 years as well, and as I told you, just by attending the meetings and being a radiation oncologist and having some interest, you can co-develop trials. So I've co-developed some national trials for SWOG. We built a very brisk single institution program here of doing clinical trials. We've actually gotten grant funding from a variety of different sources. So we now have enough grant funding to pay a postdoctoral fellow in physics. We also have a grant to start a fellowship in radiation oncology for sort of advanced training. We've developed a training course that people attend on IGRT and VMAT, written a few papers, and given a number of presentations. So I really do believe that you can build a pretty good, decent, respectable research program in radiation oncology in community practice that can rival what can be done in the academic center. Happy to answer questions or sort of talk more if people have specific things. If there's somebody who can unmute lines, or if people want to answer any questions into the chat box, that'd be great. So there's one question that came up already, and it is, how do you get help with sort of statistical analysis? So one thing you do is figure out if the hospital has anybody who could help you with that. The second thing that you can do is that you can buy some relatively inexpensive software. Some of it's available online actually for doing statistics that's relatively straightforward by yourself. The third thing that you can do is go back to the academic setting and find somebody who's involved in statistics to help you with that in return for participating on that paper. And the fourth thing that we've done sometimes is simply hire those people if we have money in a budget to do that. I personally haven't had a lot of problem in getting somebody to help you with statistics, and it usually involves just a couple of simple phone calls to somebody, and there's usually somebody that you can find that's in statistics or in one of those places that will clearly help you with that. Another question that came up is this issue of conflict of interest in private practice, and does it come up more often in private practice versus in an academic setting? So the guidelines for conducting research, whether you're in private practice, community practice, or academic practice, are all the same. The standards developed for managing conflict of interest are all the same. So I don't think it comes up any more or any less than in the academic setting. I do think that if you're going to be involved in research, and your hospital will almost certainly sort of require this, and any IRB will require this, you have to sort of take these online courses that teach you what you can and can't do. Most of them, as you're taking them, are rather intuitive about how you don't want to be artificially incentivized on the research side. You don't want to create either the appearance of conflict of interest or the actual conflict of interest. So I don't think it's necessarily a bigger problem in private practice or community practice at all. So how do IRBs work in the community setting is one of the other questions that came up. And the IRBs actually, believe it or not, work in two different ways in the community setting. One is that you can have an in-house IRB, which is put together by volunteers in and outside the hospital that will meet semi-regularly to review these projects. And the other is some community hospitals simply outsource the whole IRB process to private companies that do the function of IRB. And these private companies assemble the people inside and outside of medicine to review these studies. At Swedish, we have both. For most radiation oncology studies, we use the outside IRB for review, and there's a fee for that that's just built into whatever project you're going to do, and usually it's about $1,500 or so. In the academic setting, they often have internal IRBs. The problem is that the speed for a protocol to go from idea to completion to up and running is often dependent on the bottleneck that the IRB provides. So many of the academic centers are also going to these private companies to outsource the IRB process simply to streamline that process. So IRBs are not really a challenge whether you're in the community center or the academic center. So an IRB is actually an institutional review, and the purpose of that institutional review is to make sure that primarily that the consent form is something that could be read and understood by the patients that you're actually going to be treating, and also to make sure that the study doesn't violate any of the sort of the major guidelines around how to do a study and what would be ethical and not ethical. But it has not been a problem to do outsourced IRB. One of the things I will tell you is if you're going to be involved in either a pharmaceutical study, a SWOG study, a medical device study, or something that you dream up yourself, you'll still have to go through that IRB process, and it simply involves submitting all that documentation. If you're going to do retrospective work, my understanding today is that even a retrospective review of the charts that's going to be used for some sort of outside presentation or publication also needs to go through that IRB. Usually for those retrospective reviews, you're talking about something that can be reviewed fairly quickly. So an interesting question came up on the chat line, and that is if you're interested in doing research and you're going to a center that doesn't have any existing research, should you put that into the employment contract? And you know, I'm not necessarily an expert in what should go into an employment contract or what shouldn't go into an employment contract, so I'm probably not the person to ask. But I think that a frank discussion about where you're going to work and whether they want to do research is a fairly fair conversation to have. If they want to do research, they might need to put some resources in to supporting that research getting off the ground. And if they do, that would be fantastic because you can then use those resources to bring your program off the ground. But I guess it becomes more complicated because if you're hoping for the ability to do research in radiation oncology and somebody to protect your time, value all that you bring to the table, and treat you totally fairly in that process, I think that's flat out impossible. Okay, the problem in radiation oncology, and it's also a problem for some of the other medical disciplines, is that you tend to get reimbursed more for seeing patients and doing clinical care than you would for administrative work or research work. And so there's always going to be that tension. So I think in some ways, the best you can hope for is people to be supportive, provide some resources, and if they're not supportive and they're not going to provide some resources, you can still do research in the setting, but you might want to at least tell them that's what you intend to do so they can be supportive, at least in name. I probably wouldn't put that into an employment contract. So another question that came up is sort of how do you manage your patient load with doing research? Do you have similar volumes to other providers in terms of clinical care? So I have 14 partners in our group, and from a clinical practice perspective, I have the busiest clinical practice of anybody in the group. From a balance standpoint, I have really, really poor balance between research and clinical practice, in the sense that you know, early on, I just worked harder than everybody else, I think, and that's really the only answer I have for you, is that you know, if you intend to do this, you really just sort of have to work hard. Now, unfortunately, they go hand in hand. If you become associated with research and you're working hard, then more people send you patients and more patients find you, so you get busier. And so there's always that ebb and flow there. So it's probably worth it. But what you will find is that, you know, having done this for 10 years now, that it's not totally sustainable to be incredibly busy on the clinical side and very busy on the research side. So eventually something has to give. In academic centers, your clinical volume is a lot less, so you have a lot more time to dedicate towards research and thinking about research. Unfortunately, because your clinical volume is a lot less, you don't have the number of patients to actually ask or answer important questions. So it becomes a little bit of a double-edged sword in all of this. Another question about funding sources for private practice research or academic centers, and whether they're the same sources or different sources. So I don't think that there's necessarily a difference of pool in terms of where the money goes. You can apply to NIH, you can apply to DOD, you can apply to state money. There's a fair bit of money now at the state level because of the tobacco settlement to support a number of research initiatives. When you're competing in that pool to do research, you're competing with people from academic centers who have a lot more time, perhaps a lot more support to get that kind of money. We have not been particularly successful, even when we put huge and heroic efforts into building large grants like that. That said, within the institution that I work for, the gynecologists have been very successful at doing something like that to get a large amount of money. Some of the thoracic surgeons have been successful in that same pool. And our neurosurgery, neurosciences group has been successful, just not in the radiation oncology side have we gone after that. Where we've been successful on the radiation oncology side is going after perhaps slightly less well-known, less top-tier sort of funding sources. So more local and community sources, more organizational and foundation sources, and also, as I mentioned earlier, looking for philanthropy to support some of this. Obviously, for pharma-sponsored trials, they provide money. For medical industry-sponsored trials, they provide money. So I think that the funding is available for you. And another question that comes up is that frequently protocols require increased follow-up or non-standard imaging modalities or timing, and is reimbursement more difficult in the private setting for this? So one of the things that you have to do, even in academics today, is understand what's going to be paid for, what's considered the standard of care, and what's not considered the standard of care. And unless your protocol has money to pay for these tests that are non-standard, you have to get them at the timing that is considered standard. So if you were building in some sort of analysis based on PET-CT, you'd want to know what is the average duration between PET-CTs that most insurance companies would reimburse for. So maybe that's 50 or 60 days, but you build into your protocol you wouldn't get a PET-CT before 65 days to make sure that that was going to be paid for by the patients. In your actual protocol, you want to specify what's experimental and what's not experimental, and patients need to be aware of what they could potentially be on the hook for that is considered experimental. So I wouldn't say that that necessarily is a issue specific to private practice versus the academic setting. I think it's something that's unfortunately common to both. So I don't think that's necessarily a bigger problem. Do I believe that the chances for a successful grant application are lower if applying from a privately, relatively less well-known institution? So I do. I think that the chances for being successful in getting a grant funded from one of the main sources, NIH or DOD or some of these other places, is also less successful if you're from a lower level academic center. I think that that the system is not pure necessarily. But that's just my 2 cents. Now, like as I mentioned before, sort of the less competitive grants that are out there, the things that are more local, the things that are more foundation-based, I don't think that being from a community practice or a private practice hurts you at all. In fact, it may actually help you if that has any sort of positive reputation locally. But for these big things like the NIH, I think it is a lesser-known thing, your chances are lesser. One of the ways that you can get around that is by partnering with some larger or bigger university, I think. So if you work with a cooperative group, do you get access to their data to publish on your own questions? So working with a cooperative group means different things to different people. So if you are part of a cooperative group and you're enrolling patients on that trial locally, and you don't go to the meetings and you don't network within a particular subcommittee, the chances of you getting access to that data are practically zero. But if you are part of a cooperative group, you do go to those meetings, you do go to the subcommittee meetings, say in GI or in thoracic or in melanoma or whatever it might be, you'll get to meet the chair and the vice chair, you'll participate in the discussions that are ongoing. You can definitely ask and frame questions and say, hey, can we look at this? And if you gauge interest, you'll certainly be recruited to help out on something like that. In my own personal experience, it's not very difficult at all. Again, showing up and simply being interested in wanting to do things, there's plenty of work to be done. Remember, all these cooperative groups are based on volunteer effort. And so many of those people who designed big and pivotal trials still have questions, and they'd love for somebody to dig into that trial and that database just to answer something. They're just looking for somebody to do that work. And so your interest in that is certainly something that would be welcomed. So what are some of the examples of locally or privately funded studies that we're doing right now? Well, we have completed, we're sort of a little bit in a transition phase, I should say. We've completed one large 4-year grant that was to implement and build some improvements into volumetric modulated arc therapy and esoteric arc modulated therapy, which we completed. We also completed a grant on IGRT and looking at sort of IGRT utilization within a registry. We have funding now to start an adaptive radiotherapy program that's going to involve conforming to tumor shrinkage and some modeling around that that will be going into the future. That we're kind of excited about. We have been doing a lot of technical work on a surface mapping concept that we are starting to integrate into the LINAC so that we can use surface mapping as a way of doing gating for both SBRT and non-SBRT patients, which there's some advantage to because surface mapping reduces the radiation exposure. Surface mapping is quite a bit quicker. So those are the things that we have going now. About half of those are funded by foundation non-specific monies that came into this research program, and half of those have some industry money to it, and there's a little bit of a mix. We get asked to work with a number of new technology vendors and the old vendors who have new technologies quite frequently, but we're sort of at a spot now where we're sort of just busy enough. In academics, I think one of the things that happens is as you start to get more successful and you start to do more things, you keep wanting to grow. I think one of the things that happens to you in a community practice is that unless there's other people that join you and that are truly co-spirits of the same mind, you grow to your maximum and then you have to sort of stop right there. So we're at the spot where we're at our maximum. When you join a radiation oncology group, there's a lot of advantages for groups that are sort of tiered so that there's senior people, people in the middle, and people with less experience. But from a pure research program standpoint, you sort of want everybody at the same phase so they hit the same ground running, they all run at the same speed, but that's practically impossible to get in small fields like radiation oncology. Another question that gets asked here is, have you noticed an increase in patient referrals to your center if the trial is open at your center, and that is something that can be used to excite the private institution's board of directors to support clinical trials? So it's funny you should mention this. I spend a fair bit of my time jokingly trying to make sure that everybody understands what we're doing and the stuff that we're working on and keep the visibility high. And so I have been trying to figure out whether we can prove that there's an increase in referrals or increase in utilization. And it's not just that, right? I mean, you also want to prove that because a patient with cancer showed up at your center, they got all these ancillary treatments, so there's a halo effect, and it's very difficult to prove. It is difficult to prove, to be totally frank with you. But I wouldn't let proof get in the way of your ability to excite the people that you work with, both referring docs, your partners, administrators, boards of directors, all of the above to support clinical trials. Because the story by itself sells. Even if you can't prove it, the story definitely does sell. So I hope that answers your question. Are there any other questions? One thing I will say, I know that we're doing this on a web conference, but when you do get a job and you're out there and you're interested in starting this, I'm happy to talk to any of you by phone. Feel free to call me or email me, and I can tell you sort of the things that we did to get things off the ground, or tell you how to get started on things at your particular site, or even help to introduce people that may be knocking in our office about other people that are interested somewhere else. So definitely happy to support this wherever any of you end up. Great. Well, with that, I think it was my pleasure to talk to all of you. Look forward to seeing all of you at ASTRO or somewhere else one day. If you're in Seattle, definitely feel free to look us up. And like I said, if you end up somewhere and are interested in getting a program started wherever you are, definitely happy to help in any way possible.
I'm not sure if you can hear me, but thank you for taking the time to do this with us today. We really appreciate it, and thanks to all the participants.
Great. Thank you.